security. So let's say in this example, delete comment ID 17, right? So what if I just open up inspect element, I double click on this, and I change this to, let's say, 55. And if I submit it, and if it goes over here and it just deletes comment ID 55, when comment ID 55 wasn't written by me, I'm not the user ID that created that comment, it will still go and do it. Computer always does exactly what you tell it to do. So what could you do to prevent this function from deleting that comment if the user ID is not, if they're not the author of that comment? So you can pause the video and kind of think about that. Well, one way you can do is maybe over here, you can put an if statement and say, hey, comment ID 17, let's get your user ID. And if the user ID matches with the user ID in my session, which is the logged in user, then I'll let you delete it. Or another way you can do it is you can say, hey, delete, I'm going to pseudocode here, delete, the record in comments where you can say comment ID, in this case is 17, and you can put and user ID is whatever that is stored in your session. So this is how, one rule of thumb is you don't just trust everything that the user sends you. We talked a little bit about that. But when something gets sent, you want to do some validations like this to make sure that, hey, you have the right access and you own that, records or whatever before you process it. So that's a little bit about security. But I want to also talk a little bit more about security in terms of session. Now that you've finished the wall, and these are some of the concepts that can really help you and become a better developer. So let's think about session. Okay, so far right now, when you built the wall, and there are many ways that you could have done it, but you may have just stored, for example, user ID, and let's say your user ID is 2. So you logged in that, and that is available. Maybe you created another key called logged in, and this is true. And when they log off, you set it to be false, and then you check if the login is false, and if it is false, then you direct them to the login page. I mean, there are many different ways that you can structure your application. But let's think about security a little bit. What if someone just goes in and edits that session, the user ID? What if I just go in and change that to be, I want to be user ID number 1, because most likely user ID 1 is the super admin, right? I just go and change it, and if your code just checks the user ID, your user ID 1, okay, display all the users and give you all the edit access, delete access, that could be really vulnerable, right? So what do? I mean, you could encrypt this, but it's very easy to decrypt a number as well. So there are many different ways that you can go about to protect the system. But one possible way, and this is used quite a bit in the industry, is let's look at your user record. So imagine that I have a login page, and I put in my email and password. So in the login page, they put this in, and it validates, it checks to see if the email is there, if the hash password of this matches with what's in the database, right? But you can kind of imagine the user's record over here, and it's going to have your email, right, filled over here, your password. It also has your created ad, also has your first name, and whatever, right? So one way that you can do to make this a little bit more secure is, and this we don't expect you to do it at this point. Later when you learn more advanced framework, some of them will take care of these things for you. But it's still good to think about these things. Is, okay, so to prevent people from just editing this, what could I do? Well, what if, let's say, I take the created ad, because every user almost has a unique created ad. Maybe I, add some secret phrase, just as you did with the session in Flask, and I maybe hash it a few times, and then whatever that comes out to be that I manipulated with the created ad, maybe with the ID, some secret, right? I come up with a hash, a new hash, and let's just call it a new hash. So what if I create this, and then I store this new hash in the session. So let's say this is A, B, C, D, E, F, and 175. This is something very complicated. This can be guessed, so this is probably not. But if you use the right hash, it will look very complicated. So this is that complicated hash that I generated when the user logged in. So I stored that in session. Well, if you do this, whenever your application is loaded, right, you can put an if statement and say, hey, I want to check the user ID, but I also want to check if this hash matches with this new hash that I generated. And if it matches, then you say, oh, this is probably the user that logged in. But what if someone went in and changed it, right? There were 5, your user ID 2 or 5, and then let's say they changed it to user ID 1. You look at the user ID 1, and the computer creates this new hash for user ID 1, but it doesn't match with what you have in the session, so then it will terminate you or redirect you to this danger zone and say, hey, we recorded your IP address, we're going to report you to police or whatever, right? And then you can email your administrator and tell them that, hey, this so-and-so from this IP address tried to hack into this user account and so forth. So just storing the user ID for the wall assignment is good because this is your first time with login and registration, but we can make it more advanced by also storing something that's unique for that user that you store in session. There's no way that hackers can really guess what this new hash value for someone that they want to hack into is. So this can make it really, really flawless. We talked a little bit also about some other security, but as you learn a little bit more and get comfortable, we hope you will get better at learning how different hackers may hack into the system.